Usual stuff, 8-minute speeches. I'll clap at the 6th, 8th, and 8:15. Every time a speech ends, there's only 1 minute of grace period allowed between each speech, so make sure that you move your call, you already have most notes settled down, etc., etc. Without further ado, calling upon A1.
You might have to just grab your straw.
Oh, that's so smart. I didn't see anyone doing that before. Just take a straw.
I'll sit here.
The root of the patriarchy, particularly in developing states, has always been the exclusion of women from the ability to attain and sustain wages. It looks like the artificial socialization of a society to avoid the participation of women in secure and sustainable jobs. This looks like things like corporate jobs being more biased towards men, or education actively excluding women, especially in a country like India, insofar that women are so severe into period poverty that they are unable to access education, or the level of harassment that happens within these spaces is so bad to the point that where women feel that they simply cannot participate. But when it comes to military and security specifically, this is a job market which is inelastic, meaning that a country will always need this particular good or this particular service. But it often also provides multiple benefits, particularly in countries undergoing militarization. Things such as free education and provision of housing, which is often exclusive towards these particular spaces. We see that this particular market in opposition's world is likely to be used as a platform to further exclude women from liberalization, whether it's within their mind or financially. We see that this creates the dynamic of ownership and dependency that is the patriarchy itself. Let's bring in the context of India. The idea that this artificial socialization has in fact peaked in this particular country, given that the bulk of the job market is dominated by men, and this has materialized in the exclusion of women from education, independence, and the labor market as a whole. We see that in the historical trend of liberation, the gaps in the job market which men are unable to fulfill often act at this tipping point for women to access capital and achieve the first step of liberation, given the relative independence from men now achieved. We see for feminism in India, the militarization of this country is this tipping point which must be utilized. 4 things in my speech. First, on illustrations. Second, why the Agniveer is a unique and reliable avenue for wage access among Indian women. Third, why Agniveer is likely to have a positive effect regardless of the merit achieved, meaning whether or not you get that long-term 25% merit, you're still going to get significant benefits from this. But lastly, why opposition actively stagnates feminism within India and puts women even further behind in the race that is the patriarchy. First, on illustrations. What is symmetric? The existence of the Agniveer scheme will exist in both sides. India is in fact militarizing given current status quo, which is why they chose to implement this particular policy. This means they are trying to make the military more attractive for the sake of attracting more people into this program. What does this look like? It looks like coming with multiple benefits which are inherent towards the idea of being within the military, whether it's the provision of housing while within that military, training for those with little to no military experience. Severance are likely to be relatively high because this is 4 years of your labor that they are paying for. They are trying to attract you to join this particular program. It looks like the increase or investments in quality military quarters for the individuals within that program. Also, it looks like the provision of food and shelter during your stay. And I think for women, it is much more likely that you're going to get things like menstrual essentials and healthcare that you need for the sake of sustaining yourself. What does our world then look like? It looks like the Indian feminist movement actively encouraging joining this particular program. We see this happens on 3 levels. 1, on a social level, insofar that the promotion and the endorsement of this program will occur. It looks like the facilitation of individuals to join. But we also say that Indian feminists can be rational about this and will likely target particular groups of individuals. It's probably going to be individuals who could not access these benefits of the Agniveer otherwise. Things such as housing, things such as healthcare within those 4 years. We believe they're specifically going to target these women because these women are the ones who will benefit most from it. Second, on a political level, it's probably going to look like advocating and lobbying the government for better protection of female militants within that particular military and publishing the expectations for protections of these women that they are encouraging to join this program. But lastly, on an individual level, for the sake of attracting people into this program, it probably looks like establishing things such as a network for complaints and support in order to maximize the positivity of that experience when you are in this Agniveer scheme. What are they supposed to defend then? They're going to defend the fact that of an Agniveer existing anyways, but you will probably discourage or be apathetic towards the joining of women towards this particular program. What they must concede is the fact that men will make the bulk of this scheme and why that's necessarily a good thing. First argument then, why is Agniveer a unique and reliable avenue for wage access among Indian women? We see that the rest of the labour market is exclusionary in nature towards women. It looks like the systemic oppression of women which limits them to domestic matters such as being maids or motherhood, so on and so forth. There is little to no avenue for wealth creation in their world, in opposition's world, meaning that these people are limited to jobs which have very little wage creation. Second reason, the existing labour market enables the narrative of independency and ownership. Looks like biases in hiring, biases in education, social narratives against them. But even in the best case scenario where they're still able to access these jobs simply provide wages and not the other necessary things such as property, housing and healthcare to allow you to sustain yourself. What is the impact of this particular status quo then? We see that women are locked into a system of dependence onto men and have poor autonomy, and women have not achieved this true consciousness, meaning that insofar as you are socialized into believing that this dependency and exclusion is the norm, you are unlikely to buy into the idea of feminism or buy into the idea of you deserve further liberation because of the fact that you are so mentally used to the idea of being dependent onto men. How does Agniveer then change this? We see on two levels. One, the access towards the wage itself, meaning you are able to further curate the sense of independence for yourself for the first time. But second, looks like the experience of non-dependence for the first time for many of these women, especially within this particular age group, who have just left the property of their father or their partners if they marry young. You do not have to rely on a partner or a father while in this particular space. Why then, second argument, does the effect remain positive regardless of the merit achieved? We see that this is the avenue to the true consciousness regarding your oppression, especially in India where individuals are heavily desensitized to the level of patriarchy in that country. We see that this will be the first time that you will be aware that there is a life in which you are deserving of and you should strive to achieve, that is being independent from a partner or a father and being able to sustain yourself through a wage. And we see this is important because we've seen it multiple times throughout history. The first wave of feminism in the US occurred as a result of World War I and the Industrial Revolution, in which women were able to secure wages for the first time, and that is what liberated them, or at least acted as the tipping point for them to believe in the idea that this liberation should be sustained and these wages should be permanent. It was like the French Revolution, in which a lot of women experienced freedom for the first time and not only being seen for their beauty, in which we saw the very first pieces of prominent feminist literature within these times, such as Mary Wollstonecraft. The conclusion of this argument is clear. You get not only that buy-in towards this movement, but also an awareness within these individuals who are much more likely to be willing to step up and step out against the oppression in the future. Last argument, why is it that opposition stagnates this particular feminist movement? We see that one, there is no external mechanism which can create a similar effect. The exclusion of the labour market will still continue in their world with no gap being taken advantage of. It is only in our world that we do this. But second, we see that this avenue will then be dominated by men, which means you exacerbate this domination of the labour market by men, further excluding women and further pushing women into the entrenchment of their own marginalization. But lastly, another generation will be socialized into leadership. The last thing I'm going to talk about is why is it that women are likely to opt into this particular narrative. I think there is this sense of awareness towards your own suffering, but an inability to escape it because you don't necessarily believe that you deserve to or that you should. We say that given that this is a targeted program onto women who necessarily need these particular benefits to function, to individuals who will see this as an opportunity for their own financial liberation, which is a much more rational avenue of thought for a lot of people, we say the likelihood of opting in for the woman who need it the most is incredibly high, and we won the debate. Thank you.
I thank the first affirmative speaker for the fine speech. Now inviting this first negative speaker.
India is in a state of flux in which its bold and new progressive movement is beginning to make progress in tearing down some of the social barriers that exist for women in the status quo. Note that this team has to defend a world in which the feminist movement, which is currently in an uphill battle but still currently making progress, pivoting away from narratives which actually build women the social mobility that they need in order to build their influence within society. All of the framing that First Affirmative gives in their ethos is exactly the case we're going to deliver you today, which is that you encourage women and you push narratives of them going into corporate work, going into service jobs, actually building careers through tertiary education and vocations rather than going to the military, in which the skills and the wage that you earn are incredibly short term and do not allow women to actually break through the slowly waning caste system in India in the status quo. Note that India currently has several systemic issues that women currently face at the moment. That is to say that there are lots of deaths in domestic violence. There is currently inconsistent levels of opportunity for women to go into education. But know that those opportunities are improving. The feminist movement in India is becoming more popular. It is making progress. We are defending the status quo, where the feminist movement in India does not push you to join the military. They have to defend a pivot, and they must prove a positive benefit of the feminist movement pivoting on this issue. Which means that this team defends appealing to women broadly to divert to the military. Which means they have to appeal to women, say from higher castes within India, who would otherwise go and pursue careers in politics, in public service, in STEM, and they'll push to those careers and actually manage to build influence. For the same analysis that First Affirmative says that women can advocate for change in the military, well, women can advocate for change on a much larger long-term scale outside of the military when the feminist movement pushes them to go and pursue things like degrees, go and pursue things like vocations and tertiary education, which directly links them to longer-term careers than what you get in the military. First argument, why this is a bad narrative for the movement. First of all, there's an opportunity cost to any movement to any narrative that a singular movement pushes. There are only so many media pundits, there are only so many journalists, there's only so much time and resources and focus and energy that you can give to certain narratives, which means although there isn't a 100% trade-off, your prioritization actively weakens other narratives, which means that there's only so much time and appetite for you to give to certain narratives within India, which means that the feminist movement has to trade off and abandon a lot of the narratives that we say are actually better in the status quo. We tell you that as a result of this, the alternative path to female liberation is pursuing things like education, and the reason why the trade-off with the army, the trade-off of going into the army is so detrimental is because you lessen the amount of women who are pursuing increased social mobility within India. That is to say that when you pursue a degree that is able to get you onto the corporate ladder, that is a long-term strategy for your improvement, to pursue things like promotions, to pursue things like upskilling. The military does not produce you active skills besides just what makes you good at military service in of itself, which means that as soon as you leave the system, you do not have long-term skills in order to improve your life, improve your upstanding. Note that because of a lot of entrenched sexism and lack of progressivism that exists in the Indian military, very few women are likely to actually make it past the meritorious check at the end. But even if they are, at best, only 25% of the women can, which means that this debate focuses primarily on the thousands of women that are going to be pushed into the military who leave with a small short-term severance package that is not going to set them up for a viable future, and it's going to actually make them more dependent on, for example, settling to find a husband in the short term. Because note that this is the prime, these are the prime formative years, but a lot of these women are going to be forming their careers, are going to be making connections with things that can get them much more prosperity in the future. But I also just think generally, there are narratives within the military of women just being generally less effective as soldiers, but also just biologically, a lot of female soldiers are simply not going to compete with a lot of male soldiers, which means that in their best case scenario, when you get to that merit check, the vast majority of women are simply not going to make it through, which means this team defends a world in which you essentially give women a bunch of false hope that they're going to get some sort of long-term benefit out of this, and they're actually going to be destroyed after 4 years of trading off other opportunities when they do not actually make any good out of it in the long run. But which means that in their best case, these women are literally betrayed by the movement that pushed them to do this in the first place. And the reason why this is so detrimental is because when you forego the formative years we are often pursuing a tertiary education, when other people who do not go into this program are beginning to outcompete you because they did go and pursue that education, you leave the military with no clear pathway, with very little support network because you spent years far away from your friends, your family, your community, which means that you see women in their world more likely to fall to dependence on other people, particularly men, and have far less financial security in the future, which compounds harms of domestic domestic violence, because the best way to get women out of domestic violence is to give them long-term financial stability, to become independent. You make them more dependent when you force them to forego formative years of tertiary education in favour of going into the military. That does not give them other long-term benefits other than they might come out here and say, you teach communication better and you get a bit stronger. Sorry, we would favour you actually getting a leg up in society as opposed to that there. Let's talk about why this is a bad individual choice. I think firstly, as I've said, most do not get a long-term benefit. India is moving to a service-based economy, which means that a lot of the skills that you learn in the military, such as, battle combat skills, I don't know anything about the military, are not incredibly useful. But also, you, as a result, have less social mobility because you're viewed by potential employers as having forgone the opportunities that they are looking for when you're doing job interviews. You are less likely to have a degree. You're less competitive in getting into those degrees because people want younger, fresher talent that they can train up from the ground up, particularly in corporate careers. Or you're potentially just more expensive because you are older and therefore the minimum wage demands that you are paid higher. But you are less skilled comparative to other people that did not go into this type of program. Which means that by 21, you have a pressure to conform with society. But you have very little long-term skills, which means you are likely to settle on things or just live or work a very menial job for a very, very long time. At the very worst case scenario, at the very best case, it just delays women achieving some level of success and financial prosperity in India. I also think, just secondly, that if you do not believe that, you should believe that the discrimination and the harassment that women are going to face in the military is a debate-losing harm for this team. The military in India is one of the least progressive institutions because this would be a novel policy by what is implied by the info slide and the motion, which means that you're going to have a lot of entrenched biases and a lot of entrenched behavior that deem women as objects or deem women as being weaker in the military and therefore someone to pick on and someone to take out and someone to target because they are incredibly vulnerable. That is a massive harm in of itself because it looks like thousands of women going into the Indian military and going through traumatized, being bullied, sexually assaulted in their training. This happens in militaries all around the world in more progressive governments and more progressive societies, so it is likely to be even worse to the extent that this institution has not been accustomed to that. And women shouldn't be used as a battering ram to teach men empathy. This team has to prove that men are somehow just going to change their behaviors when women are simply around. We tell you that you just put thousands of more women in harm's way, and there's a debate-losing harm, even if it is a short-term one. The counterfactual to potentially dying in the army, dying on training, dying when you are sent to war is making women pursue, is pushing women as the feminist movement to pursue careers in tertiary education which get them stable jobs and get them better incomes. This team says that you set up support networks. The characterization of this was incredibly vague, and the characterization we got was reactive support networks. That does not negate the harm of the fact that you're sending thousands of women into the military where they're likely to be subject to discrimination and in the worst case, sexual assault. Reactive mechanisms are not good enough. We should not be pushing women into this area in the first place. We should push them and pressure them to pursue things that are actually going to provide benefit to their life. But also, there's little incentives to speak out, which means because of the fear of punishment, because of the fear of discrimination and harassment, this team does nothing to fix that. But I also just think generally, when they say access to wages and non-dependence, again, all of their analysis is incredibly short-term because it ends at the severance package, which at best might set you up for a couple months, maybe a year or two, but you forewent the best opportunity to develop the skills for you to have a good, stable career when you're 30, 40, 50, for a good retirement, weigh the long-term benefits, extremely proud to oppose.
I thank the first negative speaker for the incredibly fine speech. Moving on to the second affirmative speaker. Yep.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in my speech. First on pivot, second on hump, and third on principle of the feminist movement. First, I'll start with on the issue of pivot. So there negative side comes up and tell me that there will be a pivot. We'll say that no, that there will not be a pivot, or even if there will be a pivot, it will be minimal because of several reasons. One, know that it can be done at the same time. We disagree with high negative saying that it cannot be done at the same time. That the feminist movement in India definitely have to 100% focus on going to push for people to join the military. It definitely can be done at the same time while protecting other vulnerable stakes. They will not have to demolish their support group just to push more people to join the military. Second, know that it targets different groups of stakeholders. This is very important, China, because they say that the feminist movement, their entire case is having to support women into education. Know that there are only 10% of women in India who have chances of pursuing education to begin with. Know that for this is for the high ends of people that have so much salaries. These are the people that the feminist movement will still push to get into education. We will not push the top of the class to go to the military. That just doesn't make sense towards the feminist movement. Gut check on that. But second, know that we're debating on the most vulnerable of stakeholders, that there are no other opportunities. Listen to Atifa's speech. There are no other alternative, or the other alternatives are way harmful, like them resulting to prostitution or them resulting to drug dealing, right? These are the stakeholders we're talking about, the most poorest Indian women. Third, note that a resource shift towards military focus will not happen. Number one, on mitigation, there's not much resources needed in offering this military position to begin with, because military already focus on promoting their military. So the feminist movement just needs to work together and cooperate with military promotion. But secondly, it is definitely possible. It is not an either or, there's a false dichotomy. It's possible to do at the same time. They have social media, they can post one social media post about going to the military and one about the importance of education. We don't think this is a problem. Four, this is very important and takes on the entire case of negative. Is a push towards education realistic for the feminist movement in India? Gut check, so much mechanism, missing mechanism link on side. Negative, second needs to bring this up. Two things here. Note that their benefit or their entire case relies on women actually getting this education in the long run. But secondly, that they will get this degree and will get a corporate job, because their whole case on uplifting women relies on them getting a degree and getting corporate job. No mechanism on how they will get this. Several problems, three things. One, that it is harder to get equal opportunities in education to begin with. Know that scholarship is limited for men quota, and all of the institutions in India, only 5% of them are Indian women. Know that it is so hard to get into education, it is not accessible. That is why we say that the poorest of the poor women in India would not get into a high top institution which is already racist and sexist towards women. Second, higher discrimination in the corporate world. Know that all of your board directors are male. There might be 1% of women to fill in the quota of the gender quota, but this wouldn't be enough, because they have to prove to us how it's possible that they will get this upliftment when we get into the corporate world. We think that it's impossible for young Indian women, especially at the age of 17 to 22, to even break this barrier. And even if they're in the corporate world, they will always be a corporate slave. They will never climb up the corporate ladder because of all the barriers that exist. Third, know that it's highly expensive to get an education, especially in India, where the education is still uprising, still trying to be developed, and scholarship does not exist for these young individuals. Second, on harm. Why the scheme will not actively harm women. This is the back part of negative speech, that it will like sexual assault and stuff, right? 4 reasons under this why the scheme will not actively harm women. Note, number one is the active incentive of the feminist movement to ensure good quality of the scheme. Note that the feminist movement is the one trying to encourage women to join into this scheme. This means that they will ensure that this scheme has good conditions, right? 7 reasons why this is true. Number one, they will set up rules and regulation for women in order for them to join this military camp. 2, there are complaint avenues, providing complaint avenues. 3, providing call-out mechanisms. 4, lobbying the government to ensure safety of these women. 5, publicize the support to ensure surveillance towards these women. 6, preach women on women, support women in the camp, right? Because there will be a collective effort that a lot of people will call out each other and will complain towards this feminist movement in any cases of harm. But 7, note that the military itself, wanting to encourage more people to join, more women to join, will make sure the adequate safety measures in this place itself. The conclusion here is that it is a safe program and it's high quality and it's beneficial. That is why the feminist movement will encourage, because it will be unrealistic for the feminist movement to join something that is for sure going to hurt the woman. Second, on check and balance. Note that rules and regulation exist and military law is way stricter than any public law. They have special court, and they will get kicked out of the military the moment they abuse or sexually assault a woman. The scheme is temporary, which means that it's easy to kick out the wrongdoers. But second, the possibility towards call out and to challenge the government. Note that when this program becomes unsafe, it is easy to blame the government and to fix the system. Government have an incentive to keep political will and to keep votes, therefore they will create a good condition for this program that they offered to begin with. But third is the pushback and call-outs from public and support groups. Note that these feminist groups backlash in India is strong, and there's international attention, and there's a larger pushback from public when something is involved in the military. Note that everyone is always involved in the military. That is why the Bangladesh protests happened towards the military, to the military quota, because we really care about our military, especially in a case of India. That's why it will be a very surveillance program, and it will be safe. 4. On the better protection inside the scheme. In a world where it is dangerous and there's not much alternative, we rather them going into a surveillance military camp than going towards prostitution, going towards drug dealing, which is way more dangerous, the alternative that negative has to defend. In conclusion, it is safe, but even if it is unsafe, it is the stepping stone to ensure that women are treated better in the military camps for long-run empowerment and better rights is material towards this woman. Lastly, I'll talk about why encouraging women to participate in the military is in line with the feminist movement in India. 3 reasons to this. Number 1, not how it empowers women economically and empowers women's rights. Number 1, on economically. Note that they will receive wages and this severance package, which Atifa already told you, to most likely be high, because we want to encourage people to join, right? Money will be funneled into the upliftment of life. They have a chance to live their dreams and survive in the real world. This looks like investment, opening up an account, or at least to put food on the table. Because at youth age, note that everything is expensive. They can use this money in order to get the education that negative side wants. It's a prerequisite to any benefit that negative side wants. It will, but socially, the next panel, it will be a challenge towards men. It will uplift the image of women, and it will also upskill women. Not that women will now know how to fight, but also in the military, you learn administration. This is where you have better chances of getting job afterward. But also, if you join the military, you have right to bear arms. This means that after you go out of the military, you can use that for your protection if anything happens. But second, note that it directly challenged the patriarchy, that men are no longer the saviors of India. We can see women as similar, capable than men. Therefore, even if the 25% women joining in, they become heroes, they carry legacies. This is what will shift the perception towards women. This is the actual upliftment that we're trying to create. In conclusion, for the feminist movement, it is just and obligated to put women into any avenue that would empower them.
Thank you, second affirmative, for a very gratifying speech. Now moving on to the second negative speaker.
Interesting.
Affirmative tells us that there's not a massive pivot for women to be able to join this thing and then afterwards, after 3 or 4 years, go out of the military and join regular civilian life. I think this is hugely untrue to the actual experience of people who have served in the military, who have served in active combat zones, or who have served in other capacities, because of the fact that the military becomes your life for 4 years, everything you've learned within those times is relevant only to the experiences in which the military. That is why people like veterans, even if they only serve, for example, one tour, have a really hard time reintegrating because they have things like PTSD or things like the fact that regular culture don't understand military culture because of the fact that the military culture is incredibly stringent, unlike civilian life. I think that is incredibly important. A couple of things I'm going to do in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about what this policy actually looks like, because they give us a whole bunch of framing that I actually think is not true. Then I'm going to talk about the weighing between long-term and short-term, and finally I'm going to go off and do some extra rebuttal on why they actually have access to education and why that's really important. Let's talk about what this policy looks like, because essentially they tell us, well, this looks like publishing records or lobbying the military for I guess like better places to be better places for women, for example, giving them sanitary items or healthcare or a couple of things. I think there's a couple of responses to this. First and foremost, by the same reason of I guess like lobbying, we can have increased capacity to be able to have increased narratives or spend our political capital to be able to improve the lives of women outside of the military, i.e. make it easier for them to get into tertiary education by implementing quotas, for example. But secondly, like even if that wasn't the case, I think there's still two reasons that it just isn't true. Firstly, it's just the military has a huge culture around hazing and being tough, and what that looks, just like look at what they put people through, right? They make them not sleep for like 5 days in a row to like, I guess, get them through basic training. They make people run with like incredibly heavy loads. They literally, like in the United States, they literally gas you to make sure you're like gas resistant. All of those things are incredibly harmful. The outcome of this is by saying like, the way in which this will actually play out for women is when women join the military, high command in the military, or I guess literally your drill sergeant will be like, you don't get access to sanitary items because you have to tough it out in basic training because that is a character building exercise that makes you better at warfare, blah, blah, blah. Those are the sorts of narratives that get run within the military. It was completely untrue why the military was suddenly bent over and become like civilian, super nice, and like, here, have some sanitary item, have some pads. Oh, it's your period? Oh, I guess you don't need to go around. All those things. I think the military is actually incredibly unsensitive in that regard, or I guess like uncaring in that regard. I think the second thing to say is that the military is just like famous for being really culturally misogynistic and misogynically tough, as we tell you at first. The result is that like this results in having some of the worst rates of sexual assault and just like general harassment for women, right? Maybe not sexual assault, but like harassment is still probably incredibly bad. The reason why this was particularly important was because it made it much worse for you to be able to report other people and actually have some sort of outcome from that reporting, right? For example, if you get touched inappropriately or if you get catcalled within the military, it's incredibly hard to report that to a superior officer because your superior officer has, like, if the military hasn't had women before, right, there is an incredible, like, I guess, cultural narrative around supporting your comrades within the military. And when women first join, they consider the out-group within that military organization, right? What that means is you're much more inclined to support the in-group, that being men who do catcall and all those things, which means that it's probably unlikely that they get the sorts of benefits that they try to claim. Yeah, okay, let's then move on to the weighing between long-term and short-term. Because essentially, why is our side for the long-term health of India, like, just so much better for the long-term health of the Indian feminist movement, and why the short-term, like, impacts aren't that important? I think the first thing to say here is that we just have way higher access to be able to access political changes, right? Because of the fact that, actually, I'm going to talk about access to education before I talk about this, because I actually think it's really important. Because the first thing that they tell us is that, oh, well, there's rich people and there's people in high-class situations, and we won't push them to the military because of the fact that they need to go into tertiary education. But the nature of the situation and the nature of why people cannot access tertiary education or other instances of higher education is because they literally do not graduate things like, for example, high school, right? Like, they pull out of things like high school. That is the sort of narrative that we're saying maybe women, like the feminist movement, should support and run narratives about maybe you should actually graduate high school, and that's probably the most important thing, because the reason why they are locked out of tertiary education is because of the fact that they do not finish high school education and do not have access to be able to actually join join tertiary education institutions to the extent where we actually signal to women that you can and you should finish high school rather than joining the military, that was probably much better for their chances of gaining higher education. But also the second thing to say here is that this is just like super disenfranchising for poor women or women of low caste in India to be like, you're not good enough to be able to like go to higher education. So the only thing you're good for is a battering ram in the military to be able to have better military policy or like slightly better outcomes within the military. I thought that that was probably extremely harmful for the amount of political buy-in that you necessarily had within India for the feminist movement. That was particularly bad because then you have less political capital or less people like capacity to be able to sell narratives to people because, you know, for example, like people talk to each other and they're like, I don't actually think this policy is good. I don't think the direction of the feminist movement is necessarily super good in this country. I don't feel like I should necessarily support this. Okay, let's then talk about like the long-term versus short-term after we talk about education, because that is the reason why we have more access to better political changes, because we push women into positions of power, we push women into positions of political power, into positions of like consulting power, into positions of legislative power. There's a whole area, like it doesn't have to be you go into politics, right? There's lots of other things that you can go into that has meaningful, tangible effects for people and for women in the long run. These people actually have a capacity to be able to make changes in regards to policy, but like for example, make changes to policy or set legal precedent that actually affects women in just a whole bunch of ways, whether it's, for example, pushing subsidies, quotas, or any like, you know, or female-friendly institutions, right? Like the Neg app has no capacity to be able to do this because when you join the military, like in democratic countries, the military does not have political capacity to be able to change policy because the military is beholden to the like civilian branch of the government, right? Like they're beholden to the government that exists, which means that they have no capacity to actually change any sort of policy. At their best, they have some sort of like capacity to be able to benefit women economically in the short term because of the fact that they get subsidies, because of the fact that they get employed. But like trade that off with in 5 years, in 10 years, the capacity for us to make legislative change within the Indian government was so much better. That benefited so much women in so many other areas, like for example, jobs, healthcare, legal representation. All of those things are beyond just military service. We give women economic independence. Let's then talk about why they actually do not access their short-term benefits like they try to claim. Because essentially they tell us, well, they give more money, they give women more money because of the fact that there's sort of a militarization of India, which means that there's probably a high severance, etc., etc. Yeah. I think first thing to say here is just like most women probably will not make the 25% mark because of all the reasons that we tell you at first that go relatively unresponded to. I think that relatively stands. But let's then talk about even if the severance is necessarily high. I think you just have no capacity to make any sort of change going to the future, right? Like even if you get paid like $5,000, like that doesn't last in a long time. For those reasons, so glad for those.
Thanks, second line for that very, very fine speech. Now moving to third affirmative.
Should I? I hate you. What's so political?
I actually don't know what's happening there. To the rubber.
What is a man?
Hey, you're in a rush, you know.
Relax. So this. Chair, if the feminist movement had to restructure its entire organization every single time a new form of feminism or new policy that feminism wants to implement happens, we would have a different form of feminism every few months. Because intersectional feminism inherently incorporates different forms of feminism or different diasporas every single day, the moment in which we understand and define different characterizations of the human experience in and of itself. When the transgender intersectional feminism movement appeared and was being fought for, it didn't suddenly deprive the feminist movement of all the previous things that they were fighting for, because you are working in tangent with other human beings. It is not as if you are a single monolith that does not have access to the outside world. In fact, Hanafie himself already mentions to you that you're going to be able to cooperate with the military. Military is incentivized in and of itself to cooperate and have more people enlisted so that they can have a better optics for the country, better optics for the government, better optics and training for the individuals of the country, because they have certain KPIs to fulfill in and of itself. So it's likely the military is incentivized to get more people to come on. It's likely then that the feminist movement doesn't have a lot of capital or necessarily critical mass that is needed to be able to proliferate this to begin with. Three issues then. Firstly, what is the likely frame? Secondly, what does the military look like? And thirdly, which side better proliferates women's change? Firstly, on the likely frame. Negative provides an extremely privileged frame. I'd like you to note this, Chair, because these women do not have the choice or privilege to pick what jobs they want, to see what educational fields that they have the prowess to participate within. Negative themselves concedes that the access to education for these women is likely limited. So their counterfactual, the solution to this is threefold. Firstly, that the feminist movement can use counterfeit to be able to put money into promoting education. They don't prove to you how exactly this gets any policy change, other than just women are being noisy, somehow the government is going to listen to them and women are going to be able to access education. It's unlikely, because the ability for you to access these platforms depends on women being on the same platform of men in the first place. What's important to note here is that these women do not have a choice, do not have access to basic amenities or food, etc. So the ability for them to access this in the first place was argued in Atifa, when she told you that these women get basic access to education, basic access to food, basic access to all of these important things that women on the ground will otherwise die from if they did not have access to. So in the short term, we allow these women to be these extremely vulnerable actors to at the very least live a few days, because under their side, it's not certain that they would have lived those 4 years, but comparatively we are certainly able to provide sanitary and hygiene, etc. to these women to be able to fight and live, and at the very least, and then end with some amount of money that they can end with in the end. Secondarily, they tell you that they're going to be able to get these women into places of power somehow, just because they have political capital or will. The ability for you to do so is contingent upon these women being included within these spaces in the first place. When Hanafie tells you that these women have military training, weapon permits, and protection while they're in the military, what this means is that when women leave these places, they are better equipped to deal with the problems around them during and after employment. And during employment in and of themselves, it includes women within the discussion of an extremely male-dominated area, by the way, which allows them to be perceived in better manners in other percepts of society. The moment in which you are seen as a literal woman who's been in the military and who's gone all through these things, such as what first neg says, second neg says, such as hazing, etc., you're seen as toughened, you're seen as someone who is competent. And when you go into the workforce, it's not as if the workforce has nothing that they're going to be able to see and look at you. They're going to see you as a disciplined and hardworking individual who went through those 4 years, rightfully so, and you have some capital to go with it. And I'd like to note, there was onto my second issue next time. But basically, both sides agree that these women are disenfranchised. What's better, leaving them in disenfranchised with no protection in the wild, essentially in India, or comparatively put them in the military, where they have access to education, where they have access to food and water, to shelter, to sanitary products. Affirmative clearly takes this, because we've proven to you how the military is held to higher scrutiny. That men that do like maybe sexual assault or whatever in the military are instantly dropped and court-martialed, by the way, which holds them liable criminally. So it's incentivized, because more often than not, the military wants to avoid any negative press, because they have an incentive to keep people on. So we've already proven to you how these women, in and of themselves, have no necessary thing to turn to. We're the only one to provide them with food, shelter, and ability to live these 4 years in and of themselves. Second issue, what does the military look like? India in and of itself is culturally strong. It will gang up people who abuse women. If you look at the early 2000 video, why did she slap? They all ganged up on the woman, on the man, because he slapped a woman on national television. What this necessarily means is that there is a high level of respect to women in the moment in which you are in a male-dominated field, because everyone's trying to defend the more vulnerable actor in this instance. What this necessarily means also is that the discrimination that negative tries to implicate is that suddenly, firstly, that there's going to be deliberate jeopardizing of these individuals by excluding them from sanitary products, etc., because they need to toughen up. Now, I'd like to respond. Firstly, you have military officers or military individuals pre-existingly who are already women, by the way. It's not a 100% male-dominated field where there's no support for women. It's likely that there are officers, there are individuals who have enlisted into the military previously who are women in and of themselves. And B, there's a difference between character building and deliberately jeopardizing your troops. When you have a period and you're unable to adequately take care of your hygiene, it's likely that you're going to be infringed or inhibited from participating as a functioning member of your troop to begin with. The military is very importantly presses upon strength and cohesion within the military complex in and of themselves. The moment in which you have one member who is disreputable or dysfunctional, you're unable to boost up the morale and continue proliferating the military industrial complex in and of itself. So the important here, the military is likely to not disenfranchise and jeopardize this woman deliberately. The moment in which they're likely to be facing scrutiny from the media, because every single time that the media or the government expands upon military or there's news in the military, you hear it within the week because of the fact that it is one of the highest scrutinized industries within every country. You know what America spends on its budget militarily. You know all of the drama that happens in the military. The important thing then, secondly, is that we don't send these people to war. It's a 4-year program. Only after the program do 25% will receive proper enlistment into the military. Mostly it involves administrative work, it involves skill training, and you are able to be more functional humans after this because of the fact that you get this education which you would otherwise not have been able to get. Side negative, I have not proven to you at all how exactly these women are going to be able to get education under their side, other than just saying advocacy for the sake of advocacy. Hopefully something sticks. Issue number 3, which side better proliferates women's change? Affirmative have importantly told you, number 1, that we're going to be able to get these women on the same platform as a man in a male-dominated industry. They then have the ability to participate in these discussions by virtue of them being a part of it. Exclusively this happens on affirmative, because negative does not have any avenue by which the women are involved within this diaspora, because they don't have access to education. B, the fact that they work with men involves them with men largely, so they're going to be working with men when they get out of the workplace. They're going to be able to then network and buy into these men. Also, money to just start their whole life with. Thank you very much.
I thank the third affirmative speaker. Now moving on to the third negative speaker.
Before I start my speech, I'd just like to mention, as a trigger warning, I will be mentioning sexual assault and femicide. Firstly, Firstly, I will be charitable to the affirmative team and prove why even in a world where they only impact the most vulnerable of women, they are still causing more harm than good to these very, very vulnerable women. Secondly, I'll explain to you what actually happens in this debate and why the affirmative team has a burden to push this narrative on all women, because note, the topic says women, not just vulnerable women. It's scrolling for the affirmative team to claim that they will be extremely targeted in their messaging and they won't spread the messaging that in order to be a good feminist, you need to actually apply this rhetoric to all women. Also note that in order for I'll mention that later. Okay, cool. So this so there is a trade-off that the affirmative team has to make. They have to apply this messaging to all women. First off, even in a world where it is only the most vulnerable of women who enter the military, I think the first thing you need to ask is why does the military have an incentive to cater to women? I think the affirmative team never really explains this or gives very weak explanations. They tell you that India cares about its military. They tell you that it is under immense scrutiny. But even in places like the US, where feminist outcomes are far better and the military is under even more scrutiny, there is still rhetoric going on around women still quote that they experience very high levels of sexual assault that goes unresponded to and uncared about in the US military, and we've also seen a rise in rhetoric from the head of security of the United States talking about how women are given lower standards and we should admit less women to the military because they're not as strong and not as capable, right? So I think this is going to be compounded in India, especially for these very vulnerable women who have little to no political capital. We're told that these feminist movements will have lobbying power. It is unrealistic to see why these women who are probably malnourished, who probably don't have very high in the caste system, don't have a lot of social or political capital, are going to be cared about when they come forward and tell people that they have been sexually assaulted. It is unclear. We tell you that there are actually adverse incentives to believe these women. First off, it is these men who are often more physically strong. They often have better military outcomes. They probably are considered higher of merit and are more likely to be given return offers to the military, and they are more likely to be in this top 25% of these Agniveer applicants. Right? So they are more likely to be listened to, they are more likely to be valued. On top of this, the people who are in positions of power in the military are all men under the status quo. They tell us that the Indian workforce is predominantly men and predominantly very sexist. We tell you these issues are compounded and far worse inside the military and in a space where the whole mentality is to tough it out and also just go with the flow. Don't break the social code. Don't not listen to your general because whatever they say is tea and you need to conform and you need to listen to your general. I think it is far harder for you to come forward as a woman and come forward and this very meritable, stronger man has sexually assaulted you and have anyone believe you, especially in a world that the affirmative team is trying to claim where only the most vulnerable of women go into these positions. They tell you that the alternative for these women is dying. I think this is uncharitable and unrealistic. These women have made it up to the age of 17. They probably have had enough food to make it through their childhood and adolescence. So the alternative is actually probably getting married and being a housewife and having children for your husband. I would prefer this to them getting sexually assaulted and maybe experiencing femicide in the military, right? They don't prove to sufficiency why this call-out culture is actually going to work. If it doesn't work in more liberal states, it's unclear why it will work in India. Okay, cool. And also in response to the claim that they will be more respected when they leave the military because they have proven their worth, I think first off, when you see a world where women do not meet this 25%, where they are more likely than not to be dropped from the military after these 4 years and not get a return offer, they are seen as weak and ineffective, and it is seen as a weak attempt to prove that they are actually as good as men, but they are in fact not. Secondly, when a woman has a right to bear arms and is carrying a gun around her community, she suddenly becomes a target to instances of femicide. She is not in fact stronger when it is instances of femicide in India are at an all-time high. It is unclear why having one woman carrying a weapon in her in her hometown is going to change this. Okay, cool. Secondly, what actually happens in this debate? Why do we have better outcomes to the feminist movement? Cool. First, as I said, in order for these call-outs to work, it requires a high level of buy-in. So you need women of higher caste who have more social political influence to be joining the military. You also need women to be joining the military in much larger numbers than the affirmative team is trying to claim in order to actually accrue any of these benefits, in order for call-outs to actually be effective, right? So I think, so therefore, it means that they do have to accept a world in which women who may have otherwise gone on to tertiary education, women who come from privileged backgrounds, who would have gone to university, are going into the military because they believe it is their feminist duty, because they are already feminists, they are listening to the prescriptions of the feminist movement. It's not women who don't think they have any value already and are not already feminists who are going to be going into these institutions. It's women who are likely already willing to listen to the feminist movement. And when the feminist movement says this is what you need to do to be a good feminist and uplift the rights of women for all of India, they are going to listen to it and they are going to go into it. That means you're going to see things like women who potentially would have gone to university, would have gotten stable jobs in large institutions, or maybe even gotten some sort of political power, are more less likely to under affirmative sides of the house. What does this mean? I think they misunderstand our case, because they tell you that these vulnerable women are never going to go into politics in the first place, and therefore you shouldn't believe that our case is better for them. But women in positions of power benefits all women, right? Even if these are women who are of high social standing already, when they make legislation, when they when they get into positions of power and are able to advocate for the rights of all women, it is more likely to see changes from the ground up, right? Because they talk about intersectionality. Intersectionality means even a high caste woman is going to see the issue of femicide in her country, realize that it's something that is very proximate to her and she empathizes with as a woman, and is going to be a strong advocate for correcting it for women of all social standings. Therefore, a world where you see even even if our impact is small, even if you have 1,000 less women going into positions of politics in the next 25 years, I think this is an incredibly high setback for women's rights within India. We would much prefer a world where women were actually able to, climb the work ladder, gain a position of influence in India, and be able to make the structural institutional change that is in fact required to actually get some degree of change in the culture and the social narratives around women in the workplace. The other thing to note is that even women who do not go into politics, women who go into the workforce and an incredibly growing service economy in India, if they are able to gain some piece of the pie in there, if women are able to climb to some level of leadership or authority, they can also in their own workplaces make it a better, more inclusive place for women. You can have women who become hiring managers and are not as discriminatory as men in a world where you reduce the amount of women who go into their roles because they're being pushed into the military, they're being told that this is their duty as a feminist. This is incredibly harmful. Also, you have a world where a lot of these women come out after 5 years and they don't have a tertiary education. The incentive to go on and become a wife and mother, the incentive to fulfill your gender roles in India is incredibly pernicious. They feel like they are behind because they've missed out on 4 years of their life. They're behind the rest of the community. We would much rather educated women who become wives but still have some level of social autonomy and authority than women who have nothing for them. So what do you believe in this at the end of this debate? Even in an affirmative world where only vulnerable women join the military, they're worse off under our side, under us, their side, and better off for all women under us. Thank you.
Thank you, third Neg. To end off Neg bench, I invite Neg reply. That's OC.
Okay, cool. It was incredibly uncharitable for the affirmative team to claim that we have zero capacity to push women into civilian spaces that are relatively good for women economically into the future, relatively good for women politically into the future, because under the status quo, we can observably see that the conditions for women in India is relatively better. It was this is an abandonment which ends the chances of increasing women's accessibility in the general civilian space, and the harms of that was so bad. Let's then talk about whether we have access to education, and then I'm going to talk about harms to women, and finally I'm going to talk about whether the affirmative can necessarily access this nuanced narrative that they want to access. Firstly, on access to education. I think we tell you something that's relatively simple, right? And it is a very low burden thing to prove as well. The tipping point of access for education for women in India, especially tertiary education, isn't necessarily that high, because what is stopping them from being able to access education is the fact that they need to, for example, finish the last year of their high school education, right? That's a relatively low burden to push to be able to prove that women needed to finish that last year of education, which unlocked a lot of benefits of tertiary education, and that was probably very important. The affirmative response to this was just like, well, this is relatively unlikely because India do not have, because in India you do not have access to tertiary education for women in low socioeconomic situations. I think one, this is just like fundamentally unresponsive to both our characterization framing that we give you at first, that I just talked about in my intro, but two, the mechanisms that we provide about the low burden that we need to meet to be able to access those benefits that are necessarily provided. What does the impact of this mean then? It means that even if it is relatively speculative, at our worst case, even if it's relatively speculative, women in positions of power in a long period of time means that they can push through better policies, even if that policy was unintersectional. Like, for example, they push through policies about better healthcare for women. That benefits all women, no matter whether you're rich or poor. That should be weighed extremely highly, because that was a certain benefit. Even if we push through one policy, the scale of that policy benefit was incredibly large. Let's then talk about harms to women, because we tell you a couple of things that was really, really important. We tell you firstly that under characterization, even in super hawkish countries like, for example, the United States or even in Europe, it was still relatively bad for women, and women still experience relatively high levels of sexual harassment in those instances. It was unclear why it was under the counterfactual or under the instance of India why it was necessarily better. They needed to prove this. The only mechanism that they necessarily give to is that, well, they can just have more, they can just signal better and just prove, essentially just like signal better and use political capital in a nebulous way. But I think our third response to this very, very well in saying that one, there are mostly men under the status quo who are currently in charge of the military and in high positions of power in the military, and are therefore the ones who are likely to commit sexual harassment. It was probably incredibly hard to report on those individuals because they're seen as incredibly prestigious. Two, they tell you that women are seen as they tell you that even if this wasn't the case, outside the military, after they finish military service or they have severance packages, whatever, if women do not make the 25%, which they most likely do not make, we basically run away with this characterization in the debate. What that means is they most likely will not get hired by other jobs, because the perception isn't necessarily, oh wow, this woman served in the military for 4 years. The perception is that, wow, this woman served in the military for 4 years, but they didn't make the cut to be able to serve long term in the military, which means that their work ethic or whatever it is necessarily isn't as good. And the last thing that they necessarily tell you is that in order and then the affirmative, the other affirmative response is necessarily, noting that this directly responds to all of the material that the affirmative gives about how you can just necessarily report this. I'm glad to, of course.
Thanks, Neg Reply. Now, to conclude this debate, I have to fly.
Who are we talking about? Two, who provides better safety nets, and lastly on liberation and the movement itself. First and foremost, who are we talking about? We introduced you very early on that this program will probably target one or more women. It's people who cannot access these benefits elsewhere, things like temporary wages, healthcare, independent childcare, so on and so forth. This is intuitive, but it's also logically correct, given that movements in general will usually have campaigns which target people who they want to target and will benefit the most from these particular things. I don't think this is necessarily something we have to do exclusively, meaning that the moment in which you talk about this particular form of feminism, you're going to forego things such as intersectional feminism. It just doesn't make sense. Opposition largely unengages with this, and in that they have this very strange and absurd accusation of squaring. I want to note that there are cases developed around a vague idea of woman, which results in a very it would be nice case, but not necessarily why they would achieve those nice things. Why must this debate be centered centered around these particular women who are vulnerable and cannot access these benefits in another woman. First, because the military in general is an avenue to social mobility. This means that even absent of a gender discussion, the ability to choose otherwise than the military or this Agniveer program is in fact a privilege. The bulk of people who join, whether you're a man or a woman, are probably seeking some sort of financial security anyways because you are unable to get it through the job market. This is because of an awareness that the military is in fact tough and therefore you are likely to choose otherwise if you could, but you can't, meaning that this is the most vulnerable woman that we're probably going to be discussing. But second, note that the push for education will happen anyways. Even if they want to push that the feminist movement has to forego education because of some logical loophole and somebody forgot that education matters for social mobility, we see that the external narrative of being in a developing country pushing for education is something which will still motivate the women who can access that avenue to access that avenue. What does this mean? It means that the metrics of the debate is the benefit provided to those who cannot access those benefits. Elsewhere, these people who by 17 have little to no education, but second, have an inability to access the theory education and would never be able to compete in the job market. Second clash then, who better provides safety nets? What do we say? We say that we give them an access to a wage as a prerequisite towards true consciousness. This is one of the lowest barriers to wages for these women. And my second speaker talked a bit more about how there's multiple incentives to do well, whether it's from India or these feminist movement. Opposition tries to engage with this by saying you're unlikely to get married and it's a short-term benefit, the education is better, and they have concerns of sexual harassment and trauma. Why do they lose out in this clash? We say that one, they are living in a severe vacuum. We've seen it very early on that the patriarchy is equally severe outside of the military. Why does workplace harassment disappear the moment that they push for education? We say that if it's going to be equally horrible for these women, we'd rather it be horrible in an era which is heavily monitored by the Indian government because they want this militarization to succeed. But second, note that there is a lack of an alternative in their world. They have a vague and unclear counterfactual. The burden on their side, which was unachieved, is that the narrative of education will materialize into women getting into education. We see this as unlikely because it's still incredibly expensive. Also, you compete with a sector which has no interest in pandering towards you. But third, why is this alternative insufficient? There is a mechanistic gap. Also, even if it was, it's a privileged benefit towards women who, when we could have been spending those resources on more vulnerable women. What is the comparative by Thai government then? We say that one, at least basic education that wouldn't be accessed anywhere else is accessed in our world. This means things like reading, arithmetic, basic training, so on and so forth. We say your ability to step out and have social mobility later is better. But second, this is a sector which wants you. India is militarizing, which is the reason as to why they decided to implement this whole thing in the first place. Which means the likelihood of having the demands of the movement and you as an individual appeased is so much more likely because of that desperation of India as a country to actually achieve success in this sector. Third clash that, liberation and the movement. We've told you early on, and this is unengaged, that wages change your mental calculus. You are deserving of a life beyond ownership and dependency. They say they will leave and be married off. We say that the delta in the particular case is you are conscious of what liberation could look like, that you deserve a wage. It is only an hour that we pander to these women who would never be looked at otherwise, and we won the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Affirmative. That's all for debate. Across the house, and we can record for the liberation to occur. Thank you, everyone. So, call. I actually didn't prepare general. Actually, I did prepare general feedback. One thing, and then on the OA. So we thought this was a very high quality round. It was a close round, we both agreed, but ultimately it was a unanimous vote for the team inside of negative. So negative wins the debate, commiseration inside affirmative. But again, it was very close and very high quality round. I just want to adopt one response, actually one feedback. Actually, I'll split this into two. The first is just that I think both teams are a little bit doomer in the way that they do responses, in which that the way that both teams respond to other teams' cases is to presume the worst case characterization of the comparative of either education or military, which of course isn't a bad strategy, and I still encourage to use that strategy, but I think overuse of that strategy becomes a little bit unclear in terms of weighing the extent of which worlds are like more likely. So even if the characterization is true, I think it's important to either A, engage in the instance of where the characterization is plausible, where you're like, maybe they made a bunch of claims that say this characterization is likely not that bad. Even if those characterization was true, we're going to still explain what's going to be shit. Just that kind of level of strategy would be helpful in just making the debate a little more easier to weigh. I think on the second thing is just that when it comes to being able to wait, actually, never mind. I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm just going to write to the OA, just make life everyone's easier. So, let's talk about two things. Firstly, on whether or not women in India get good outcomes out of the the military thing. Secondly, on whether or not negative achieves outcomes on education. But before that, I just want to clarify the idea of the framing / meta clash that kind of occurred in terms of what is the actual comparative of the round? Is there an actual trade-off? Because I think there's a bit of a disagreement, like not really a definitional thing, but just a bit of an agreement of where these resources going through, can you target women, etc. I think the way we kind of just resolve this is, the way I think about it is that this is still at the end of the day a priority debate. That's the first thing. So yes, you can claim some extent of intersectionality, like EAF can claim this, but then that also concede Neg can claim like doing some extent of the military. But I mean they don't claim that, but I think it's just something. I wouldn't step in to say that they win on that because of that alone. But I think on the second thing just to point out here is that in a priority debate, I think it's important to explain why the trade-offs the trade-offs you are taking do matter, or like in terms of what you're taking down, what you are losing and what you're gaining. And I think what we ended up resolving to is, firstly on AF, they tried to say we'll target vulnerable women. Fair enough. Logically kind of true that you will target social movements anyway. I think Neg tries to say they'll target, and I agree to some extent this is true. Maybe like AF might target the rich woman who doesn't choose politics and goes into the military. There's probably an instance of which this is true, but at the same time, I also think AF is fair to point out that the vast majority of this round is still probably going to occur into the ways that this targets towards the more vulnerable women. So we'll just stop there and say like that's the comparative, and in terms of the resources, the priority is what matters more rather than trying to wash everything out by claiming each other, because then it would be a really weird debate of extents. But yeah, luckily that doesn't really become a huge thing. All right, let's talk about the military. I think Affirmative is very strong here, explaining why is it that given that, so the frame here is that India is militarizing and there is a huge opportunity for the feminist movement to be able to do this. I think AF gives a lot of persuasive mechanisms on explaining firstly that the incentive for women to go into the military is generally good, because the fact that it's a nice way for them to prove themselves and get unique benefits, like things like that, they get administrative training. Second, it's a good way to branch out of the current perception of women, which is the patriarchal society of India often paints women as these dependent, like vulnerable folks, and it's a good thing that they're able to essentially go through. And I think later down the bench, they do a lot of work to try and mitigate the harms that come from Neg, which is just the incentives for military to protect them, the incentives for the military and the capacities to ensure that women are protected. I think at the end of the debate, I would just comment that regardless of the response that comes up from Neg, extent of the incentives to protect women and some extent of the benefit still does remain. And I think the reason for that is because a lot of the Neg response does come hinged on like the characterization that there's going to be such a crappy society, which whilst they do prove is still a relevant frame and around for the response to do. I don't think it explains why in every single instance women are completely fucked and that there's no way for women to improve. I think regardless of the mitigation that comes on AF's mechanisms on how they implement the policy, it still can be reasonably assumed that the degree of lobbying that comes from the feminist movement and the degree of awareness you're able to claim out of this shows a good incentive to try and protect. Regardless of this though, why is it that Neg is still able to clinch out in terms of the way they respond to this material? So the first thing that Neg comes up and points out here is just the culture of the military, especially when it intertwines with the patriarchy of men and etc. So I think they do a lot of stuff explaining things like, it's a cultural of toughing up. It's a lot of harassment cases. And I think they give a good empirical example of the fact that even in the United States, there's still a huge amount of harassment cases. And all of this boils down to the fact that the military is still a male-dominated sphere. I understand the intention of Affirmative is to essentially try to breach that, and I think they do a good amount of mitigation to the mitigation by first claiming that, hey, there are some women still in power. Secondly, the only way to get a change in the first place is to join. And the third, it's like there are some ways to protect women and ensure the mechanisms to protect women and ensure some form of awareness that comes from the feminist movement. And I think some extent of the scale of AF benefit on the huge amount of awareness can still be credited on side Affirmative, regardless of this response. But I think the reason we gave the Neg team here a lot more room in terms of this was first because a lot of the AF mitigation and mechanism to try and explain why experience in the military at the end of the day mostly just stops at leading me to believe that the feminist movement has a huge capacity or has a relevant amount of capacity to be able to A, change the cultures within the military, but also B, create a sustainable career within the military in the first place. And I think this is where Neg creates a few important observations, specifically first on on the outcomes that happen outside of the military, I think AF lets Neg get away with the claim that there's no merit. But I think secondly, there's a huge question on whether or not this is a tipping point for you to get the extent of benefits of liberalizing yourself and being aware of your wages. Because I think if we talk about the impacts here, even if AF points out that wages often is a prerequisite for you to access other things, I think firstly Neg does correctly point out here that that extent of benefit is still short term. And I think AF tries to hinge on the fact that, well, it's still something you get that you wouldn't have gotten either ways, but I think in that case, it does directly concede that this would be the only thing you get. And I think what AF needed to explain here was outside of the military, assuming the best case of the characterization of the military, how was it you were able to use that changing incentive? But I also think the changing perception stuff is something that it's a tad bit unclear on side of Affirmative for a few reasons. The first is this, that a lot of Neg response explains that if patriarchy is going to somewhat be symmetrical either way in terms of the way that you're going to view women into this, what about the women who don't get the merits? What about the women who are going to go out? I think they make an important claim on the fact that once you get out and your subsidy or your wage doesn't come out, it's incredibly unclear on how uplifted you are, because there's a high likelihood that a lot of these people go back into the families that they were once dependent on. And I don't think Affirmative really defends that case scenario happening, and Neg does prove why that's likely to occur, specifically when they explain that if it is still going to be patriarchal, if it is going to be about vulnerable women and wanting to protect them, it is still incredibly unclear to us the extent of protection outside of the military. So I think the conclusion to the military stuff is a fewfold. The first is in the experience of the military, meaningful mitigation of Affirmative proves that there are incentives to change the behavior. There are incentives to be like, well, maybe we won't be assholes to women all the time. But I think what needed to be done here for Affirmative to significantly win was to explain how is it that they were able to meaningfully change the behaviors of men. We get claims from Affirmative that they can change the behaviors of men, but this also needed to be subsided with Neg's claims on why is it that men have a far larger incentive to uproot the power dynamic and maintain it. Because even if AF says, well, they're now changed, they proceed, I think the extent of how much this claim flies in the round in terms of men changing their perception of women as wrong interaction, given the existing structures that allow men to uproot the power, the extent of change is plausible because of the contact theory stuff, but it's not fully clear on why this wins. But I think more importantly in the second stuff, everything that happens after the military is an outcome and impact that Neg does explain they're able to win on, which means that in the best case scenario of AF, maybe they get some change in terms of making the military a little bit more better and giving women more wages, but it's just not fully clear to us to what degree that is a tipping point for this initiative to be a good thing for women to go to and generally something to get out of. Secondly, is it comparatively better to get education on Neg's side? So I think both teams concede directly that India is a relatively patriarchal society, but Neg does point out that regardless of this, there have been some increases. Firstly, the fact that India is an increasing service-based economy, I think this is something that doesn't really get much of a response from AF. But also secondly, I think while AF so I understand the criticism from Syed F, which is to say that, well, what extent do Neg explain on why is it that they're able to fix their problem? And I think a lot of material from 2A does explain that, hey, it is still a conservative society. It is still going to be discriminatory in terms of the workload, in terms of everything. And if you're going to target the vulnerable women who don't have an education, this is going to be bad. But I think what Neg correctly observes here is that, firstly, the problem is not something that is perceived to be so deep in terms of the how it's solved, especially when they explain that the important thing is just to make sure that they are able to finish education. And I think given the counter-fiat possibility, given that AF uses fiat to push for lobby and military, Neg uses counter-fiat to push for education, it's not fully clear, given AF's response, why this was impossible for the Neg team to do, why it's impossible for Neg team to push for education. I know AF's other response is, well, this is symmetric, but then it just becomes about extents, right? So even if it is symmetric, that you can still have intersectionality, I think Neg can still claim a slightly higher benefit of being able to ensure that these women get an education in the first place and stuff like like that. Then what about the experience in the workforce? Why does this improve on-site neg? So here I'll say I don't think neg sufficiently does work to explain why women's experiences in the workforce would be any better. Like this is something that is probably the one of the biggest unfulfilled burdens inside negative that Affirmative A correctly points out and B correctly proves that's not going to be happen. So I think the conclusion of this is that it is not going to be a good experience on neg. How do we weigh this? I think the first way we weighed this was the specific claim that came out later on the importance of the feminist woman needing to ensure that women get, even if it is marginal, get some opportunities, especially when you compare the opportunities you get from the military and the education. So the opportunities from military that I've claimed are, well, some training, you get some wages, and you get some perceptive change. As I explained before, the extent of which this impact wins the debate in terms of meaningfully getting some form of change exists, but is generally limited by the scope of the society. And if we then compare it to next benefit, even if it is a heavily mitigated benefit by discrimination, the first thing I'll point out here is that if the military is that unsafe, I think the comparative of working and going into this workforce, Affirmative only proves that you get raised, like it is not accessible, but that's something that not meaningfully, but someone gets dealt with. But secondly, at least you're not like in the extent of probably getting harassed to the extent. I think that's something that like negative can somewhat say. It's because of the fact that the experience there is still something that is far more meaningful in terms of the skills you're getting. But I think the second thing here is on AF, I think the more important claim that Next says here is that losing that 4 years of experience is something that is incredibly substantial to the career of a woman, specifically in their ability to uplift themselves. So for AF to be able to win that trade-off, they of course need to explain the prior benefits accrue, which is to say that even with that trade-off, you were still able to uplift other women, inspire yourself. But on neg, without that trade-off, they are able to explain that with the lobbying that can happen, there is still an ability to ensure some amount of ability for women to opt into this and ensure the cycle of possible exponential growth from like women in politics and women in the corporate field. Maybe they don't change the socio-economic progress, like the conservative culture of India to a huge extent, but I think what they do explain is the specific ways of getting women into specific fields that are far more important for the sake of women in India. So the end of this is just basically when it comes to comparing what you get out of the military versus what you get out of the educational field, on both extents, it's severely mitigated on the level of like good quality of life you get in there. But I think Neg explains that there are far more plausible long-term impacts that do scale up over time, especially in terms of the utility that women can get out of these jobs. Even if there's some plausible utility you get from the military side, the extent to which that liberalization and being more aware of things like wages is something that's relatively still unclear on AF and far more clear on Neg, and that's why we thought Neg won the debate. So thanks everyone. Thanks all.